Hello, my name is Dr. Reinekke Lengelle, and I'm an associate professor with Athabasca University in Canada and a researcher with the Hague University in the Netherlands. This presentation for the Autoethnographic conference for 2022 is going to be about how the theory of the dialogical self, founded by researcher Hubert Hermans, can influence and support our work as autoethnographers. It did in my case, and I'm going to, of course, tell my own story, as we are apt to do as autoethnographers. And I'm going to talk about some of the benefits that this theory will have in the way that we might use it for writing. So I want to have some fun with this too, and definitely want to invite you to make use of it yourself, even here in this presentation. So this is a mini workshop and a presentation all in one. So what I'm going to ask you to do first, and I'll put this question out there to you, and I hope that you will write it down for yourself and then pause the video just temporarily so you have the time to do that. So what I'd like you to do is to write down a question that has been following you around. Maybe it's a life question, or maybe it's a question about how you're doing your autoethnography. So the question might be something simple like, how do I continue on to finish my book, because I'm working on the last chapter and struggling with that, or I'm having trouble writing this particular story about my mother or father, and I would like to know how to do this in an ethical way, because I know maybe my sister will have hurt feelings around it or something like that. So choose a question that really is sort of compelling for you. You can dive deep into something really meaningful and even difficult, or you can say, no, I don't want to do that. I will just start with something that's a little simpler. How do I make enough time to study autoethnography so that I can start in the first inroads into my article or book? So please pause the video now, and then we can restart, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the dialogical self. Okay, so you've written down your question. We're going to be working with this later, so it's really important that you write it down. It's something powerful about writing it down, as we know, as autoethnographers. So I'll read a little bit about the presentation that I prepared, and then I'm going to hop in and also read you a little bit out of my book, which is called Writing the Self in Bereavement, A Story of Love, Spousal Loss, and Resilience, which came out in January 2021, which is exactly a year ago. My spouse, Frans Meyers, on which it was inspired by his death by cancer in November 2018, so it's 3 years now, inspired me to write this story and tell my story. And I discovered that the whole journey of grief is not always what we expect. So, and I've presented a little bit on this before, but we imagine that when our partner dies, that we'll feel wretchedly sad all the time for a very long time. That's sort of the assumption that we will have, and that we will miss them in every way possible. And all those things are true, but there's a lot more that happens in grief, at least in my experience, and in the experience of others that I've talked to and read in part. But these are not always things that we have a whole lot of easy time discussing. Like, one of the things I found difficult to discuss was missing him sexually. Another thing I found difficult to write about, it took me quite a long time and lots of editing in my book to write about, that I was actually angry with him about an unresolved issue that we had, that I had to process really after his death. The other taboo thing was that I had some ambivalence towards friends who supported me in ways that I thought were not very useful or didn't feel very useful, even though these were well-meaning people in my life. Some of my relationships have shifted since the death of my spouse. Things happened that were unexpected for me. And I wrote about those things, and I want to do that in this autoethnography, but I wanted to do that in a way that was respectful and sensitive at the same time. So I struggle with that, and I noticed that there's, I would say, well, there's a part of me that wants to say that, and there's a part of me that wants to say this, and there's a part of me that, and these were seemingly in conflict with one another. But when I made use of the dialogical self theory, which I'll talk more about in a moment, I realized that being all those parts and having all those very different sort of conflicting voices in me is actually a very natural part of being human, and that there's actually a wonderful theory that describes that. And if you know some of the traditions, there's other theories, there's various theories that describe us as multi-voiced, and having multiple selves, as it were, within the self that also feels integrated. You know, we have a sense of self, a feeling of self, hey, that's really me, but at the same time, we're conflicting and multi-voiced, and we can observe those various voices, which is always fascinating. Another theories that have sort of touched on this is, for instance, the work of Hal and Sidra Stone in voice dialogue, and the work, of course, of internal family systems by Richard Schwartz, and the dialogical self theory by Hubert Hermans. And I had the great fortune to know Hubert personally. He was a friend of my spouse's, Frans Meyers, and Frans introduced me to Hubert about 10 years ago. And I had the wonderful fortune of knowing this research psychologist who lives in the Netherlands. And I speak Dutch, as I'm Dutch as well, and was able to connect with him in both languages through all the writing that he's done, and also, table conversations as friends. And so I wrote an article about him, which was published in 2021. And I will also read a little bit about his theory from that article, as I got to know him quite personally and wrote about him as a vulnerable researcher, which is, of course, by extension in this tradition of autoethnographic research. So that was really exciting. But let me begin with something from my book about this idea that we are multi-voiced. And then I will, at the end, I will conclude why this can be so useful for our autoethnographic work. So I want to read you an expression that intrigued me. Let's start there. People in grief become more like themselves. People in grief become more like themselves. Well, this is interesting. Interesting from 2 points of view, at least 2 points of view. This is a quote by bereaved author Roger Rosenblatt, who lost his daughter to heart failure. Notice that he says, become more like themselves. Themselves, very plural. So intuitively he got it right, because we actually have a lot of selves that come into play even more strongly when we go through a difficult life transition. But the thing I didn't agree with was the sentiment of that piece, which is people in grief become more like themselves, like we have a self that we can become more like. Interesting. I thought about this. I thought, when in grief, was I more like myself? Really, is that what happened? And then I realized, no, actually, there was more voices that came strongly forward. And interestingly, too, you could also say that I became a little bit more like my deceased spouse, because I took some of the wonderful things and wonderful attributes that he had, the strengths that he had, and really still kept looking at the world through his eyes, even having written dialogues with him on the page. So in that sense, I took him with me, and he became one of my sub-selves, you could say, that I carry around with me now. Not as more as the external position that he was when he was a walking, living, breathing human being, but now he's internalized in me. So that's another part of the dialogical self theory, which defines the self as a dynamic multiplicity of selves in the landscape of the mind. So a dynamic multiplicity of selves in the landscape of the mind. That is the definition that Hubert Hermans uses with colleagues that have written a lot about the dialogical self. So we are multi-voiced, and we have I positions that are constantly positioning and repositioning themselves, and they're also contradictory. I will tell you one of the most contradictory things that I realized when I was going through grief is, for instance, that part of me was very true to the writer's ethic of being an honest human being and telling the truth about some of my feelings, like, for instance, my anger. But then there was a part of me that was very loyal, of course, to Frans, and wanted to defend him. So any moment I would say, yeah, well, he wasn't ideal. The other part would say, yeah, but, he was a generous, wonderful person, that I miss dearly. So this was in conflict with one another. But at the same time, because I knew that that is how we are built, that is a definition of the self, that we have these multiple parts, it was a lot easier to reconcile that. I didn't need to be the consistently loving, good widow who said only nice things and showed the shining example of being a loving person. That was just that's just one dimension of me. There's other dimensions that really requires fairness and justice. There's part of me that's impatient, that wants affirmation from my ego, all of those things. So realizing that, it means that when I write and use it in autoethnography, I no longer have to be so worried about what impression I make or if I'm getting the story consistently accurate, because what is accurate in the story that we tell? If we're writing about our mother or our spouse or our brother, we're going to have mixed views. And these mixed views will contradict one another. So there might be a part of you, for instance, that's very ethical, and there might be a part of you that's very angry and would like to say some things that you might not really be proud of later on. But it's still good to give voice to some of that before you get your inner editor out and help you yourself adjust some of those things in ways that you know you're going to be happy with into the future, and that respects other people while also respecting the truth. And so, this is the fine line that we as autoethnographers always are walking. We're walking that very fine line. So anyway, I realized, who is the self? I asked, who is the self? Was I less myself before Francis' death? How might I conceptualize identity in a way that helps explain what is happening to the me in the wake of a spouse's death? So it turns out that from research, when we lose a spouse, our identity often shifts. Our worldview, the reality that we believed was the worldview, like we should grow old together, everyone lives to be at least 80, right? Those things are shattered, and then there's this invitation to start to explore the self that we are becoming in the wake of loss, and that's a different kind of constellation of inner positions than before. So let me give you a little theory of the dialogical self, so you have an idea of the theory behind what I'm trying to say here. And I have articles that I can share, so you can get in touch with me, and I can send you a copy of the article too. It's actually free online for 1 year, so I can also send you a link to that. So this is from the article that is called Portrait of a Scientist, and Portrait of a Scientist in Conversation with Hubert Hermans, founder of the dialogical self theory. So this is the background of the theory itself, and I'll use the abbreviation DST to abbreviate the dialogical self theory, founded by Hubert Hermans. DST was first presented in a joint article almost 3 decades ago, in 1992. It was particularly inspired by the ideas of psychologist William James and literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. In the works of these scholars, Hermans noted expansive ideas of the self that psychology seemed to be missing hitherto. James described an extended self that included others and made clear that the self is not located inside the skin, but extended to the environment. Indeed, James argued that not only are our thoughts and feelings a part of us, but so are the people who influence us and who we internalize, like mother, partner, rival. This is perhaps why we may feel we are in conversation with writers we have never met, whose ideas compel us, but who were not alive in our lifetime. It may also explain how we can experience loved ones who have died as an inseparable part of us. Many people, in fact, report still hearing or talking to those who have died via an internal dialogue. The concept of continuing bonds and bereavement is well established, in fact. What piqued Hermans' interest as well regarding Bakhtin's work was the idea of differing voices within the self. These voices are like characters in a novel. They can talk to one another and seem like separate people. Bakhtin considered consciousness a polyphonic novel. In stories, usually crafted by a single author, characters are created that are relatively autonomous. They are even capable of disagreeing with the author, even rebelling against him, much like we experience this within ourselves. The combination of these original ideas about the self led to the conceptualization of the dialogical self. The self is a dynamic multiplicity of I positions in the landscape of the mind, with differing voices that can speak to each other, interact creatively, and represent an extended self. In opposition to the Cartesian model of identity, DST posits that we are not a singular individual self. The Cartesian definition of self is equated with the mind, separated from others, and separate from embodiment. DST does not imply such bifurcation. Rather, in DST, we can position and reposition in relation to others, which we do in an ongoing internal and external conversation that includes emotions as I positions or embodiment. Example, the pain in my body is speaking to me about a need for rest. In the DST's conception of identity, the way in which we change can be explained as a dimension of positioning and repositioning. Our collection of subselves, or what in DST is referred to as I positions, position themselves, for instance, I am educated, and reposition, but I need to expand my knowledge and engage in counter-positioning. I am ignorant about a great many things. There is also the transcendent experience of depositioning, where the depositioning I is no longer attached to or influenced by any particular position, but participates in a broader space of transcendental awareness, which is often described in the literature as a mystical experience. This should not be confused with a metaposition, which represents the ability to observe various positions and take a helicopter view. Another key position described in the theory is the promoter position, which shows an openness towards the future, an ability to integrate other positions, and can reorganize the self towards a higher level of development. I think when we're working in autoethnographic work and we're actually writing about all the subcells and other parts of ourselves, there's a kind of integration that actually takes place. So the narrative is a way that we can weave together the threads of who we are and have a sense of completeness and integration and a sense of wholeness, even though in a way that's an illusion. Like the story just holds us together. But if we're always open to revision as well, that expands the possibilities and can help us also use our writing as a form of well-being. So, and actually that's my background and expertise is writing for well-being. And I've used my book also as a way of healing. And part of that healing really depends on me embracing this multi-voiced self that I am and can be, and that I can also observe at the same time. So there's that part of me that sits back and goes, she thinks that, and there's that voice, and there's this voice, and there's that going on. And this metaposition is that witnessing. And it's a healthy witnessing, because I'm not split up. Those parts are not split off from each other or dissociated, anything like that. But they are actually all present, and I'm actually present to them as well. In speaking with Hubert Hermans about identity change and the self in the context of his divorce from his second wife Agnieszka, and about the death in 2018 of my partner Franz, I could see that using the dialogical self to conceptualize changing positions in relationships forestalls a need for absolute truth or singular way of seeing the other or oneself within experience. So it is not necessary to be consistently identified with one aspect of experience. For instance, to determine that now that we are divorced, we will no longer be meaningful to each other. Or in my case, now that my spouse is dead, further conversation with him is impossible. Turned out not to be so. Because also, like I say, Franz is an I position now within, which I carry around and can speak to. So whether you are spiritually inclined or secular, whether you're an agnostic atheist or a believing person, you'll find that the internalized other, the one you have lost or lost contact with, is still a part of you in your dialogical world. Hubert can conceptualize the change from I as no longer spouse to I as collaborator and valued friend, as they have stayed friends and work together still. Albeit this loss did require an acknowledgement of distressing feelings and time to reposition. Hubert also had an existential experience in a church with powerful music following the breakup of his marriage that could be considered an incident of depositioning. Yet, he did not need to consider himself incongruent or unusual in pursuing a friendship with his ex-wife after heartache in the same way that I can continue a conversation with my deceased beloved without needing to be religious. These are specific examples of viewing the self as diverse and dialogical and showing how the theory is generative. Now back to our question, back to your question. You wrote down a question at the beginning of this mini workshop presentation, and it was a question that was important and vital to you. So now I'm going to invite you to have a conversation with that. So you will start with your question and say something like, how do I write, ethically about my mother when this and this happened in my childhood and I'm feeling uncomfortable about putting it on the page? For instance, say that's your question. Now I want you to imagine that here, this painting behind me, this is a painting my daughter made, Sophia Lengelle, and she, in it is, in this, well, you can see whatever you want to see in it, but there's a piece of driftwood here, and inside is the journal. And I see that as the heart, our working, writing heart. And I want you to invite the voice of your inner wise writer to go into dialogue with you about this question that is alive for you. So you will start with your question, and then you'll say, hey, wise writer, what is it that you might tell me about this question that I have? And then go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and take about 5, maybe even 10 minutes to do that. And then you'll discover what sort of inner resource this dialogical self might provide. So if you like, you can pause the video now again. Okay. To conclude, I'll conclude with something that's perhaps, well, hopefully a little bit funny. But when I wrote my chapter, one of the things I wrote about we as academics who are writing and using this method is, aren't academics people who research by reading books and sending out surveys and then processing the anonymized data of their research subjects? For instance, if they study sex, they certainly don't speak about their own experiences. That is, unless you are one of those weird autoethnographers. I hope that this presentation has inspired you to think about identity a little bit more broadly and see that we have multiple resources within. We are going to be naturally dealing with ambiguity and ambivalence, but if we see that as something that we're dealing with multiple parts of ourselves, and that those multiple parts actually create some of that ambivalence and ambiguity, rightfully so, but that we can actually navigate that quite well, then maybe the use of the dialogical self and using it actually to conceptualize the self in your autoethnographic writing may be really useful to you and helpful into the future. And I hope it will be, because after all, we want to have the freedom to write those stories that are most pertinent to us, and we want to be able to wrestle with some of the tensions that also brings up when we do so. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and we will have conversations as colleagues, I'm sure, as the conference proceeds. This is Reinekke Lengelle. I'm speaking to you from Edmonton, Canada, and it's been a pleasure to join you.